The portrait still hung above the fireplace in the great hall at Ashworth Hall when Cecily arrived home for her father's funeral, 2 years ago now, and she had stood before it for a long moment in her traveling clothes, still dusty from the road, and looked at the 4 faces painted there. Her father, her stepmother Dorothea, her brother Edmund, and herself, aged 17, rendered in careful oils with her dark hair loose over one shoulder and her mother's garnet earrings at her ears. She had looked at that portrait for what she understood. Even then was the last time. By the morning of the interment, the portrait was gone from the wall. In its place hung a landscape of no particular distinction, a flat rendering of the Ashworth meadows in summer, and the rectangular shadow left by the larger frame was still visible at its edges, a pale ghost against the darker paper. No one in the household acknowledged the change. The footmen moved through the corridors with their eyes correctly forward. Edmund caught her glance across the breakfast table and looked away first, the shape of his apology already becoming familiar to her. The apology of a young man who did not yet know how to resist the woman who now managed his house. Dorothea herself never mentioned the portrait. She did not need to. Cecily had spent 6 months in the village before the invitation arrived from Mrs. Holt of Caldervale, a widow of modest fortune and genuine kindness, who required a lady's companion for the season and the better part of the year following. The position paid £32 annually, which was not comfort, but was survival. And Cecily had accepted it with the same quiet steadiness she brought to most things that could not be altered by complaint. She packed 2 trunks, said goodbye to Edmund in the stable yard while Dorothea watched from a window above, and did not look back at the empty rectangle above the fireplace as the carriage turned out of the gate. Caldervale sat 3 miles from Ashworth Hall along the eastern lane, which placed it squarely within the sphere of Ashfield Park, the principal estate of Samuel Johansen, Earl of Dunmore, whose family had been neighbors to the Ashworths for 3 generations and whose reputation in the county was for brevity, competence, and a coldness that the local gentry attributed variously to pride, grief, and temperament. Cecily had met him twice before her father died, across crowded rooms where she had been nobody in particular, and both times he had inclined his head with the precise courtesy of a man who made no promises with his manners. She had not thought of him since. She thought of him rather more after Mrs. Holt accepted his invitation to the midsummer gathering at Ashfield Park. The gathering was the sort of occasion that filled the large rooms of a great house with the most important people in 3 counties and left everyone else pressed toward the walls. Mrs. Holt moved happily among the better sofas, while Cecily kept near the periphery in a white muslin gown that had been good 4 seasons ago and was now simply clean. Her only jewelry, the garnet earrings from her mother that she wore at every public occasion, because they were the one object Dorothea had not thought to claim. The rooms were lit with more candles than any 4 houses in the village combined, and the light caught the diamonds and pearls of women whose gowns had been made in London, and Cecily moved through all of it like a ship navigating a reef by memory rather than chart. She heard the first one near the east windows, from Lady Rutherford, who was speaking to a woman Cecily did not know. The Ashworth girl, yes, the elder one. Poor creature, quite displaced. One wonders what she lives on. The words were not aimed at her. They rarely were. The cruelty of that kind of comment lay precisely in its comfort, in the ease with which the speaker could believe she was simply describing facts. Cecily moved on. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing footman and held it without drinking. Dunmore was standing at the far end of the room near the garden doors, and she was aware of him the way one is aware of a change in temperature before the source is located. He was speaking with a man she did not recognize, and his attention appeared to be entirely elsewhere, which she registered without consequence. She was not there to be noticed. She was there because Mrs. Holt wished to come, and Cecily's function was to ensure that Mrs. Holt arrived safely, found her friends, and returned home without tiring herself unduly. She was crossing toward the refreshment table when she heard it again, this time from Dorothea herself, who had arrived with Miss Lavinia Ford on her arm. Lavinia, who was 22 and exquisitely dressed and positioned beside Dorothea with the practiced ease of a woman who had been told all her life that she was exactly the right sort of person for every room she entered. Dorothea's voice carried the particular carrying quality of a woman who has learned that a sentence spoken just above a whisper travels further than a shout. She is here as a companion, you understand, a hired companion. It suits her better than Ashworth ever did, I think. Lavinia smiled with her lips and said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Cecily did not change her expression. She chose a biscuit from the table, set it on her plate, and was turning away when she became aware, without looking up, that someone had gone still very near her. She looked up. Dunmore was 4 feet away, his dark coat immaculate, his face carrying the expression she had catalogued in him before: correct, contained, and offering nothing. He looked at her for a moment that was precisely 1 beat longer than courtesy required, then inclined his head. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I am glad you could come." It was not a remarkable sentence. She had no reason to believe it meant anything beyond politeness. She curtsied, thanked him, and went to find Mrs. Holt. What she did not observe, because she was walking away, and because she did not think to look back, was that he watched her cross the room, and that his eyes moved once, briefly and without invitation, to the garnet earrings at her throat. The gathering became routine after that. She attended 2 more evening assemblies at Ashfield Park across July and into August, both on Mrs. Holt's account, and she performed her function at each one with the same invisible competence. She guided Mrs. Holt to her friends. She deflected the occasional clumsy question about her family situation with pleasantries that committed her to nothing, and she kept her attention on whatever the room required rather than on what she might have wished it to offer. She noticed, in the way one notices the weather, that Dunmore generally knew where she was in whatever room they shared. She told herself this was the instinct of a host, which was logical and required no further examination. If you have ever watched a woman practice the daily discipline of not wanting what she has been told she cannot have, you will understand the particular quality of Cecily's stillness at those gatherings. Leave a thought if something in her circumstance touches you. We will continue. The witnessing happened on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of August, and it happened by accident, as the most important things often do. Cecily had come to Ashfield Park to return a volume of natural history that Mrs. Holt had borrowed from Dunmore's library, a small domestic errand that did not require her to see him, and did not expect to. She was shown into the back passage near the kitchen stair by a footman who had misunderstood her direction, and she was reorienting herself toward the library when she heard the raised voices from the kitchen itself. A woman's voice sharp with accusation, and a younger voice low with distress. She pushed the kitchen door open without quite deciding to. The cook, a large woman called Mrs. Pryor, had a kitchen maid of perhaps 15 backed against the long work table. The maid's name, Cecily would learn, was Rose, and she was new to the household and had not yet learned how to keep her face still when she was frightened. Mrs. Pryor was holding up a small packet of good tea, the kind that came from the locked cabinet in the still-room, and her voice was carrying the weight of a verdict already delivered. "Found in your apron pocket, girl. You will not tell me you did not take it." Rose was shaking. "I did not, ma'am. I did not take it. I was given it. Someone put it in my apron while I was at the range. I swear it." "Swear all you like." Mrs. Pryor turned toward the door, already composing in her face the expression of a woman who intends to bring a matter to her employer's attention, and found Cecily standing in the doorway. The cook's expression reorganized itself. Cecily had no authority here. She was not a member of the household. She was a guest's companion, which was a category with no natural place in a kitchen dispute, and Mrs. Pryor's face made this calculation in the space of 2 seconds. Cecily looked at Rose's face and made her own calculation rather faster. "Mrs. Pryor," she said, in a voice she kept level and pleasant, "may I ask when the tea cabinet was last inventoried? I ask only because I know Mrs. Holt keeps a similar one, and we found last spring that the lock had been tampered with, and items moved before the maid, who was suspected had even begun her employment." Mrs. Pryor stared at her. Rose did not move. "I am certain," Cecily continued, "that you would not wish to bring a matter before his lordship that later proved mistaken. If the cabinet has been properly inventoried and the quantity correctly noted, there will be a clear record. If it is not, perhaps the matter is worth examining more carefully before any accusation is made permanent." It was the kind of speech that required nothing to be called a lie, that offered the cook an exit without demanding she take it, and that put enough uncertainty in the room to make certainty feel expensive. Miss Pryor held the packet for another moment, then set it on the table with the deliberateness of a woman pretending she had not been outmaneuvered. "I'll check the inventory," she said. "The girl can go." Rose went, casting a glance at Cecily as she passed that was too raw to be only gratitude. Cecily turned to retrieve her dropped errand and found Dunmore standing in the corridor behind her, the library volume still in his hand, the door to the kitchen only just wide enough to admit his presence at the frame. He had been there long enough to have heard most of it. His face held its habitual stillness. But there was something in the set of his jaw that she had not seen before. A quality not of coldness, but of effort. As if the stillness was costing him something he had not expected to spend. "Your business was the library, I believe," he said. "Yes," she said. "I came to return your book." He held it out to her. Their fingers did not quite touch, and she was careful to be sure of it. She walked back through the passage and out to the waiting carriage with the volume under her arm, and she did not allow herself to think about the quality of his expression for the length of the drive home. She nearly succeeded. He came to call on Mrs. Holt 3 days later, which was within the bounds of neighborly courtesy and required no particular explanation. He sat in the small drawing room at Caldervale and drank his tea and spoke with Mrs. Holt about the harvest and the road repair near the eastern gate, and Cecily sat at the writing desk near the window and attended to Mrs. Holt's correspondence with her eyes on the page. She was aware of the precise moment when the conversation paused and his attention shifted, and she was aware, without needing to look up, of the direction in which it shifted. Mrs. Holt noticed too. She said nothing until he had gone, and then said only, quietly and with some precision, "He asked about your family, Cecily. I told him what was public knowledge, and nothing more." Cecily kept her eyes on the letter she was sealing. "Thank you," she said. What Mrs. Holt did not mention, and what Cecily did not know, was that Meredith, Dunmore's housekeeper, who was 73 years old and had managed Ashfield Park since before the current Earl was born, had been in service at Ashworth Hall as a young woman, and had known Cecily's mother before her marriage. Had known her, and had loved her. In the particular way old women love the bright young women who preceded them in a place they share. Meredith had been present at the midsummer gathering. She had heard Lady Rutherford's comment near the east windows. She had watched Cecily cross the room in the white muslin gown with the garnet earrings, and she had gone home to Ashfield Park and stood for a long moment in front of the housekeeper's small fire and thought about a woman who had died 13 years ago and the daughter she had left. It was Meredith who sought Cecily out the following week, in the small parlor at Caldervale where Cecily was mending a hem. She sat down across from her in the other chair, folded her hands in her lap, and said, without preamble, You have your mother's eyes. I wanted to tell you that. I have been meaning to since midsummer. Cecily set her mending down. They spoke for an hour, and when Meredith left, Cecily sat for a long time in the chair with her hands in her lap and looked at the rain on the window glass, and something that had been locked inside her chest for 2 years opened by approximately 1 degree, which was enough to let in a small and dangerous warmth. It was also Meredith who, in a separate conversation that Cecily did not overhear, told Dunmore what she knew of the portrait's fate. His response was not recorded by anyone present, but by the following morning the portrait of his late father, which had hung in the Ashfield Park study with its face turned to the wall for 7 years, had been removed entirely from the room and placed in the attic, which was the action of a man who had decided that some things could not yet be righted, but could be handled differently. The wound was this. When Dunmore was 24 and newly inherited, his father's steward, a man called Graves who had managed Ashfield's accounts for 15 years and been trusted entirely, had been diverting rents from a family of tenant farmers called the Alders for 3 seasons, doctoring the ledger, and allowing the Alders to be evicted for arrears they had in fact paid. Graves had fled by the time the scheme was discovered. The Alders had left the county. Dunmore had restored the estate's accounting and settled what could be settled in money. But the Alders were gone, and money does not restore what a family loses when it is uprooted from the only land it has known. And the steward had served Dunmore's father before him, and Dunmore had trusted the system his father built without examining it, which was its own kind of failure. He did not excuse it. He had kept the fact of it as ballast, the kind of weight a man carries not to punish himself, but to keep from drifting into the assumption that the world's arrangements are honest by default. This was the man who had been watching Cecily Ashworth cross his rooms since midsummer. The audience had been reading him correctly all along. She had not. Edmund's letter arrived on a Wednesday in the first week of October, and it arrived without warning. He wrote badly when he was frightened, his hand going loose and the words running together, and this letter was barely legible in places. The substance of it was this. Dorothea had produced a document purporting to show that Edmund had borrowed £800 from a moneylender in London the previous year against the security of the Ashworth estate. Edmund had signed nothing of the kind. He was 20 years old and reckless about many things. But he was not reckless about money. And he swore to Cecily on their mother's memory, which was the only oath she had ever known him to keep without question, that the signature was not his. The hearing before the local justice of the peace, a Mr. Fairfax, was set for the 2nd week of November. If the debt was confirmed, the £800 would require either immediate payment or Edmund's committal, which was the mechanism Dorothea needed to remove him from Ashworth Hall long enough to consolidate her own position there permanently. The document, Edmund wrote, had been witnessed by a solicitor from Dorchester, whose name Cecily did not recognize, and the date given on the instrument was the 14th of March last, a Thursday. Cecily read the letter twice. Then she sat for a moment with it in her hands and thought very carefully about the 14th of March, which was a Thursday in the previous year, which was the week after Edmund had come to Caldervale for 3 days to recover from a chill that had settled in his chest. She knew this with complete certainty because she had the record of it herself. A note in Mrs. Holt's housekeeping diary in which Mrs. Holt had asked Cecily to ensure the guest room was properly aired, and the entry was dated the 12th through the 16th. Edmund had been at Caldervale on the 14th. He could not have been in London signing a document on the same day. She needed one other thing, and she had understood from Edmund's letter that she did not yet have it. She needed to know who had witnessed the original signing and whether any such signing had ever actually occurred. She wrote to Meredith that evening. Meredith's reply came within 48 hours, written in the careful hand of a woman who had learned her letters from a good teacher and never forgotten the lesson. The substance was direct Meredith had been present at Ashfield Park on the 14th of March last year when a man she knew to be Dorothea's solicitor from Dorchester had arrived at Ashfield seeking Dunmore's signature on a separate matter. The man had arrived, been turned away, and departed. He had not stopped at any local establishment that Meredith knew of. If his name appeared on a document dated that day as having witnessed a signature in London, the witness was false. She would say so before any authority that required it. Cecily held the letter for a long moment. Then she put on her coat. She told Mrs. Holt only what was necessary, which was that a family matter required her absence for 2 days, and Mrs. Holt, whose kindness was genuine and whose intuition was sound, pressed her hand and asked no questions. Cecily took the early coach to the county town, found the chambers of a second solicitor whose name she had obtained from Mrs. Holt's own attorney in Dorchester, and spent 3 hours in a plain chair in a plain room explaining the matter with the same levelness she would have used to describe a household account. The solicitor, a Mr. Pemberton, was 60 years old and had seen a great many fraudulent instruments in his career, and he said so without drama. He reviewed Cecily's materials, the housekeeping diary entry, attested by Mrs. Holt with her signature, and Meredith's letter, which established the false witness. He said that these, presented before Mr. Fairfax at the hearing, would be sufficient to call the document's validity into question, and very likely to dismiss the debt claim entirely. He said this with the precise confidence of a man who deals in facts and does not overstate them. Cecily paid his consultation fee from her quarterly wage, which left her with £4 and some shillings until Christmas. She thanked him, stood, shook his hand in the manner that surprised him briefly, and went to find her lodging for the night. She did not send word to Dunmore. She had managed the thing herself, which was as she intended. She did not owe him her difficulties, and she had no practice in asking for anything from men who had given her no reason to expect it. She was back at Caldervale by Thursday evening. She found a note from Lady Ashworth, which was the name on the seal, which was Dorothea's, which she recognized without pleasure. The note informed her that her services as Mrs. Holt's companion were no longer required, as Mrs. Holt had expressed her satisfaction with the arrangement, and it was therefore clearly time for Cecily to consider other employment at a greater distance from Ashworth Hall, which Dorothea was in a position to facilitate with a suitable letter of character, if Cecily was sensible. The note was not quite a dismissal, and not quite a threat. It was the kind of thing Dorothea did very well. Mrs. Holt was sitting in the drawing room when Cecily came in, and her face carried a quality of controlled outrage that Cecily had never seen on it before. "I wrote no such letter," she said. "I expressed no such satisfaction. I said nothing of the kind, and would not, and the woman knows it." Cecily sat down in the chair across from her. "She would prefer I were elsewhere before the hearing," she said. She miscalculated the timing. Mrs. Holt looked at her steadily. "What will you do?" Cecily folded the note and set it on the side table. "I will attend the hearing," she said, "and I will bring what I have found." The hearing was on the 14th of November at the rooms of Mr. Fairfax, who served as Justice of the Peace for the district, and whose chambers occupied the ground floor of a stone building near the Market Cross in Renwick. Cecily arrived early, which she had planned. Edmund arrived 10 minutes later, pale and red-eyed, and she took his hand in both of hers for a moment, before letting it go. Dorothea arrived with her Dorchester solicitor, whose name was Mr. Crane, and whose face at the sight of Cecily shifted through several calculations in rapid succession, settling finally on a blankness that told her everything she needed to know about his prior confidence. She had not expected to see Dunmore in the corridor outside the hearing rooms. He was standing near the window in his traveling coat, which suggested he had come some distance quickly, and beside him was Meredith, who was dressed for public purpose in a dark green mantle, her white hair pinned correctly, her hands folded in front of her with the patience of a woman who has decided on a course of action and is prepared to wait for it. Cecily stopped. Dunmore looked at her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Meredith will give her account before the magistrate, if required." His voice was the same level it always was. She wished to be present herself. I drove her. He had not come because she had asked him. He had come because Meredith had told him what she had written to Cecily. And because he had understood, without any instruction from Cecily, that this was the kind of hearing where a woman presenting evidence alone would be heard with less weight than the same evidence delivered in the presence of a peer of the realm. This was a fact of the world he moved in, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. Cecily looked at him. The chamber door was opening behind her. She said very quietly, "Thank you." It was not a declaration. It was not a concession. It was a sentence she said because it was true, which was the only category of sentence she allowed herself when she was frightened. Inside the chamber, Mr. Pemberton presented the housekeeping diary entry and Mrs. Holt's attested note. Mr. Fairfax examined them without expression. Mr. Crane spoke about the instrument's provenance, and his voice had the quality of a man who knows his account will not hold, but is committed to it by a series of prior decisions he cannot now reverse. Meredith was asked to give her account of the 14th of March, and she did so in the same careful sentences she had written, and when Mr. Fairfax asked her to confirm that she had seen the man named as witness departing Ashfield Park that afternoon without having transacted any business in the district, she said yes, plainly, and added that she had served the Ashworth family in a previous position and would not mistake the date because it was the anniversary of Cecily's mother's birth, and she had thought of her that morning, and the date was fixed in her mind. The chamber was quiet after that. Mr. Fairfax dismissed the debt claim. He used the word fraudulent once, briefly, in his summary notation, and did not elaborate. The sum of £800 was declared void and unenforceable. Edmund let out a breath beside Cecily that had clearly been held since October. Mr. Crane left without speaking. Dorothea remained seated for a moment after everyone else had risen, and her face, which Cecily did not quite allow herself to read with satisfaction, held the particular quality of a woman for whom the world's machinery has just returned an unexpected verdict. The season does not always protect those who have organized their lives inside it. Dunmore had arranged a small assembly at Ashfield Park for the evening of the same day, which Cecily had not known, and which was either coincidence or management, and she suspected, based on what she was learning of him, that it was management dressed in the clothing of coincidence. Mrs. Holt had accepted the invitation weeks ago. Edmund was brought in the same carriage, still pale but no longer frightened, and he spent a considerable portion of the drive apologizing to Cecily in the roundabout way of young men who are sincere but poorly practiced, until she told him, not unkindly, to stop. The great hall at Ashfield Park was lit fully that evening, and the assembly numbered perhaps 60, which was a generous gathering for November when the roads were beginning to close with cold. Dorothea was present, which Cecily had expected. Lavinia Ford was beside her, in a pale gold gown that had been made in London, and was very nearly the loveliest thing in the room, and her face at Cecily's entrance held the particular blankness of a woman who has been performing composure for several hours and is beginning to show the effort of it. Cecily wore the white muslin again, because it was still the best thing she had, and the garnet earrings, and she moved through the room with Mrs. Holt on her arm, and her own address forward, because the hearing had done something to the inside of her chest that she was still in the process of understanding. It had removed the passive tense from her situation. She had acted. Something had changed because she had acted. The machinery had not protected her, and she had not waited for it to. That fact had a weight of its own, and she was carrying it differently than she carried most things. She was speaking with Mrs. Holt and an older woman named Mrs. Carey, who had known Cecily's father, and expressed this with genuine warmth when she became aware of the room's attention shifting. It was the particular shift of 60 people in a room redirecting their notice toward a central point, the way a candlelit interior responds when a door is opened somewhere and the air changes. Dunmore was crossing the room toward her. He crossed it in 3 strides, which was not the measured crossing of a man navigating a crowd, but the direct crossing of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it. The room watched. Cecily, who had spent 2 years learning to be invisible in rooms like this one, felt the visibility land on her like a hand at her shoulder, firm and specific. He stopped before her and said, in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely audible, "Miss Ashworth, I wonder if you would do me the honor of taking a turn with me." It was not the sentence of a man making a polite social request. It was said in the manner of a declaration, the kind of sentence that, once spoken in front of 60 witnesses in a well-lit room, belongs to the air and cannot be recalled. The room understood this. She could see it in their faces, the 60 individual calculations running in the space of a breath, arriving at the same conclusion. Dorothea was 40 feet away and had gone very still. Cecily took his arm. They moved through the room toward the long windows that looked out over the night garden, and the crowd parted with the natural deference a room gives to its most powerful occupant, and she was with him at its center, in plain sight, which was the opposite of every arrangement she had been made to inhabit for 2 years. He stopped near the windows. The garden beyond was dark and cold, the glass showing the reflection of the lit room behind them, and in that reflection she could see Dorothea, who was still standing where she had been, and Lavinia, who was speaking to someone with the studied ease of a woman changing her plans. "You did not tell me you were going to the hearing," he said. "I managed it," she said. "It did not require you." "No," he said. "It did not." A pause. "You are, I think, the most quietly capable person in this county, and the county has been too busy being told otherwise to notice." She turned her face toward the glass rather than toward him, because she was not certain she could hold her expression correctly if she looked at him directly. The garnet earrings caught the candlelight in the reflection, and she thought, briefly and without control, of her mother. "I want to speak plainly," he said. "I am not a man who speaks plainly easily, and I mention this only to indicate that what I am about to say has cost me something." She looked at him then. "The county will tell you," he said, "that you are a displaced person, a hired companion, a woman without position, and it will tell you this in precisely those terms, because the county requires categories, and you have made theirs untidy. I have heard the term used twice tonight alone." His jaw was the color of carved stone in the low candlelight, and his voice held its level quality, but his eyes did not. "My own categories have been similarly untidy since midsummer, and I have spent 4 months trying to resolve them into something that would not make a fool of me in public." Behind them, the room was attending to other things with the slightly too careful quality of 60 people pretending not to listen. "I am asking whether you would consent to remain at Ashfield Park," he said. "Not as anyone's companion, as my wife, if you are willing, and if you will consider it without feeling that the situation compels you in any direction, because I have no interest in a compliance that comes from necessity." He held her gaze. "I am asking because I would like you here, because this house is better when you are in it, and I understood that from the kitchen passage in August. which was also when I understood that I had been a fool for some time prior. Cecily held his gaze for a moment that was not short. I have £32 in annual wage and £4 and some shillings in actual savings, she said, and I think you should know that before you commit to plain speaking. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Not quite a smile, but the country from which smiles come. I am aware of your finances, he said. Meredith is thorough. Of course she is, Cecily said, and felt with some surprise the corner of her own mouth move. She said yes. She said it simply, without performance, looking at him rather than at the room. And he took her hand and held it. And she felt his thumb move once across the back of her fingers, which was not nothing, and was not everything, but was its own kind of answer to a question she had not known she was asking. The room heard it. The room saw it. The room would speak of nothing else for a month. Meredith appeared at Cecily's elbow almost immediately, in the manner of a woman who had been standing a careful 10 feet away and had no intention of pretending otherwise. She took Cecily's free hand in both of hers and said, for the second time, "You have your mother's eyes." And this time it landed differently, in a room full of witnesses, with her name correctly spoken by a woman who had always known it. Dorothea left within the quarter hour. She said her goodbyes to the necessary people, and the necessary people accepted them. And she departed with the dignity of a woman who has decided that retreat executed correctly is not a defeat. Whether she believed it was a matter no one in the room could determine, though her face on the threshold, briefly unguarded, suggested she was arriving at a knowledge she had delayed as long as possible. Lavinia stayed another half hour, and she was gracious about it, which was to her credit. She danced with the man from Dorset who had been attempting her attention all evening, and she left with the countenance of a woman who is already revising her plans in a direction that will suit her better, which was probably accurate. Edmund found Cecily near the fireplace at 11 o'clock and stood beside her for a moment without speaking, and then said in the voice he used when he was being completely honest, "I am sorry I looked away. At the breakfast table. I have been sorry since that morning." "I know," she said. "It is done." He pressed her hand. "Is it?" She looked at the fire for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It is." Winter came properly to that part of the county by the first week of December, and Ashfield Park received it the way old houses receive familiar things, with a settling of timbers and a drawing in of warmth toward the center rooms. Cecily moved her 2 trunks into the house on a Wednesday afternoon, which was practical and unhurried, and felt, to her own surprise, entirely correct. Mrs. Holt had wept a little and then laughed at herself, and given Cecily a parting gift of a small botanical illustrated album that had belonged to her own mother, which sat now on the desk in the room that had been assigned to Cecily for the interval before the wedding. The wedding was to be in January at the parish church in Renwick, which was small and plain, and exactly right. On a Saturday evening 2 weeks before Christmas, Dunmore came to find her in the library, where she had been reading with the fire built high against the cold outside. He sat down in the chair across from hers without preamble, which she was beginning to understand was his ordinary way, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular, which was to say they talked about books and the tenants whose cottages needed attention before the hard frosts, and the question of whether the kitchen garden's southern wall was worth repointing this season or next, and at no point did either of them remark on the fact that they were simply in the same room together, at their ease, which was a condition she had not inhabited for long enough that it felt, still, slightly new against her skin, like a coat made for her specific measurements rather than altered to approximate them. She looked up at one point and found him watching her, and his face, which had held its disciplined stillness all season, held something else now, something that had no Regency vocabulary but that she understood at once in the precise register of a body that has been told, for long enough, that it is not worth seeing. He was seeing her. In the front hall of Ashfield Park, on a wall that had previously held a landscape of no particular distinction, a portrait had been hung that November. It was a modest oil, perhaps 18 inches across, commissioned from a local painter at Meredith's quiet suggestion, and it showed a young woman in a dark blue dress with garnet earrings and her hair loose over one shoulder. And the painter had given the subject an expression of attentive calm that, Meredith said, was an accurate likeness. Cecily had not seen it yet. She knew it was there. In the study, the portrait of Dunmore's father had come down from the attic in the first week of December and was resting against the wall, waiting. She had found him standing in front of it one morning, not speaking, and she had stood beside him in the same silence for a moment, which was all that was required. He had looked at her, and she had looked at the portrait. And after a while he had said, quietly and without ornamentation, that he thought it was time to put it back. And she had said she thought so too. Snow began in the late afternoon of a Thursday in December, the fine, close snow that settles without wind, and by evening it had laid a clean white over the garden and the lane and the old stone wall along the east boundary, and the light from the library windows fell out across it in warm amber bars. Cecily stood at the window for a moment before the fire required her return, and looked at the snow on the wall and the amber light and the particular quality of a winter evening in a house that was already, in some way she did not yet have the full vocabulary for, hers. The garnet earrings were at her ears. They had always been at her ears. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. Stories about women who were told they were forgettable and discovered otherwise deserve to be heard, and your company through this one is genuinely valued. The snow kept falling. The fire held.